I want to conclude this last lecture series in the first unit by continuing in chapter 17, the concept of enlightened absolutism. It's a very important concept. It will become important in European history for many years to come. Enlightened absolutism is the reaction of monarchs to the idea of reason, to the idea of these radical political ideas of rights and popular sovereignty. Several of these leaders in Europe were quite alarmed by these ideas of freedom, of democracy, of liberty, of rights. Among them were Frederick the Great of Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, and Catherine the Great of Russia. And they all three, independently of each other pretty much, although they did correspond, developed the idea of enlightened absolutism, meaning that you can allow a limited amount of social reform. You can listen to the demands of your subjects and modernize societies, that you can, to a very limited and careful degree, accede to their demands for more freedom or for more tolerance or something like that. These monarchs did that to preserve their own personal rule. They allowed a limited amount of reform from above to demand, to answer popular demand, to exceed the popular demand, to preserve their own power. So this is a sort of a new concept in a way, this modernization from above, this very limited modernization that is allowed by monarchs, who then present themselves as being typical and enlightenment and things like that. So they allowed some, for example, like Frederick the Great, he modernized the bureaucracy. He allowed promotion through merit as opposed to just noble birth. He allowed religious toleration to some degree, and he also set in place a series of administrative and economic reforms on page 431. He decided to rationalize the existing legal system to put it on a more modern basis. He abolished torture, reduced aristocratic influence, eliminated regional peculiarities, limited the number of capital crimes. But of course, all this was done, even though his subjects demanded it, to preserve his own personal political power and to put himself in place as, I am the modernizer. I gave you, the people, this, so therefore your allegiance to me should remain faithful and true. Joseph II of Austria probably went farther than anybody else because he tried very hard to embody the idea of a rational emperor. So he centralized authority. He allowed some degree of religious tolerance, and also set in place a system of economic and agrarian reform on page 433. Catherine the Great of Russia even went so far as to send for Voltaire, one of these philosophers, who, Voltaire, of course, is a classic example of this age. He was extremely critical of religion, of traditional privilege. He was extremely critical of the ideas of, well, pretty much everything. He criticized everything. And he was one of the people who worked on the rather famous encyclopedia, the Philosophical Encyclopedia. Diderot was among these other people. Rousseau, of course, went even farther than anybody else. Rousseau offered on page 425 to 6 a very radical critique of modern society. To Rousseau, it seemed impossible for human beings to be able to live according to these commercial economic values, that he believed that people needed to spend all their time and energy on trying to achieve morality and virtue and to live meaningful lives. Rousseau believed that society as it stood was evil, that people were better off in a state of nature as they had been before civilization came along. So society was an evil thing to Rousseau, and Rousseau was almost an anarchist in a way, in how that he really criticized societies. So Catherine the Great sent for Voltaire and allowed him some latitude, not very much. He was very disappointed and disillusioned by her, but she allowed him to some degree to suggest some reforms from above, and of course this was all to keep the Romanov dynasty in place, which is going to stay in place until 1917. But she again practiced modernization, reform from above to preserve her own power. She allowed some administrative reform, but not a whole lot, And basically what she ends up doing is gobbling up Poland and forcing it to be part of the Russian Empire, which it stays all the way up, until after World War I. So what happens in the end is that these enlightened monarchs, especially in France, which, the dynasty in France is not practicing this idea, are unable to satisfy their subjects' demands for modernization and for improvement, especially this newly rising commercial class, but also the peasants and other people too, even in the urban workers in this period. These enlightened monarchs are not going to be able to hold the line forever. Of course, later on, they will give up the idea of being enlightened monarchs and will become, absolutist monarchs again, as we'll see, because the American Revolution and then the French Revolution scares these people to death, and they immediately clamp down on any idea of modernization or reform or anything else, and they pretty much become tyrants all the way up through 1917. As a matter of fact, 1918, after the First World War. Even then, they try to stop the spread of these ideas of democracy and rights and freedom, as we'll see. But first, we have to see, in a sense, the logical culmination of these ideas in Europe. As they spread, the logical culmination of these ideas of rights and freedom and liberty and reason are the American Revolution. But in Europe, these ideas are going to face these noble classes in state churches and things like this, and the French Revolution, therefore, will take on a rather different character than the American Revolution, as we'll see after the first exam. So we'll start the next unit next week, late next week.